Hi, my name is Sharon Brunner. My maiden name was Sharon Marie Hike, and I was born in St. Ignace, Michigan, August 26, 1957. I don't feel like I'm turning 68 this summer, but I guess I am, and because I still hike and everything. I was born and raised in St. Ignace, Michigan. I went to Grow Cap School, which is a small rural school, out on Grow Cap Road in St. Ignace, Michigan. It's so small that there's 8 of us that graduated with our 8th grade class. And so that's how small it was. Kindergarten and first grade was a combined class because we were so small, and just I loved it. We were, we had friends that we grew up with and played games every recess. We were out playing kickball and things. We loved that. Now, we weren't as good as the boys. The boys always had to spot us points, but they still beat us. But we still played, and had our fun and stuff. And I was raised like, we had a store. It was a grocery store and a gas station. And my dad decided that, if we're gonna have a car or do anything, we need to know how to change the oil. We need to know how to change spark plugs. We need to know all these other things. And so even as a high schooler, I was a bit of a tomboy because I had to know all these things. I could change a tire quicker than my boyfriend, and so I don't know if that's a skill or not, And in grade school, we liked to put on plays for the other classrooms. And so they'd let us do this. They'd let us out of school and go and put plays on for the younger classrooms and stuff. And I always enjoyed acting. I acted in high school, and as the White Rabbit in the Wild Rabbit Chase and stuff. And I still remember some of the lines, like, "Oh, my stars and whiskers," and so I enjoyed acting. And as a child, I enjoyed going to Sand Bay and swimming, and rode my bike a lot. And I still ride a bike. And I still remember how it felt to be riding on Portage Road and going down that hill, which I thought was a huge hill at the time, because I was little, and putting my feet on the handlebars and stuff, or putting those little sprockets that, stick out on the wheel and stuff. And the freedom I felt with just the breeze in my hair, and I'm gliding down the hill and everything. And I still to this day remember that feeling as a child when I ride my bike, and I still ride a bike. One of my favorite things as a child was being outside. I didn't have to be convinced to be outside. And so we'd make forts in the woods and stuff, pretend they were houses, and we would play hide and seek, and we'd have branches and sweep and everything else and pretend that was our house and stuff, and play hide and seek. In junior high, every day we'd act out, oh God, I can't think of it right now, Dark Shadows. And so that was our big thing in junior high, and we'd watch Dark Shadows the day before and act it out, in the Cove area type thing, we'd act out. And so I guess I always enjoyed acting too, and I always enjoyed writing in the written word. I've read all my life, and to this day I'm an author, and I just published my 10th book, and working on another one too. I have the opportunity to work with this man who's in his 70s, and which isn't that much older than me now these days, which I can't believe, telling his life story. And I'm looking forward to it. And I get to listen to all these tapes, and I'm learning so much. Like one of the stories he told me in his cassette tapes was they were forced out of their home by 3 uncles that decided that they owned the home, and so they forced his family, his mother and, siblings out of that home, and they had to live in a garage with a dirt floor, and they had these bed springs that they had covered with blankets and things. He said that's the best he's ever slept because it felt like he went back to how things used to be, with dirt floors and things. And, so I get to do that too and learn about, his life. And I love learning about people's lives. I can be maybe rather nosy sometimes, but tell me about your life. Tell me, and so when I interviewed people for my master's thesis and learned about the boarding schools, the questions I asked was, tell me about your childhood. And then tell me about if I didn't hear about the boarding school in the childhood, talk, tell me about your boarding school experience. And I love learning from them and what they had to tell me. And I've been like that all my life. I just want to know things. I want to read. I want to figure out things. I want to, and like I said, I read so many books. Like one of my favorite books as a child was learning about Helen Keller, and how she survived. She couldn't hear, she couldn't, she couldn't see, and what she did to survive and what was important to her. We owned a grocery store with gas station and stuff like that. I don't know if I said that earlier. And so I learned how math became really easy for me because I had to count change all the time. We didn't have the cash registers that tell us what the change was, Like nowadays, we had to figure that out and count it back to our customers, And so we had to count change, we had to wait in customers, fill the shelves, It's a good learning experience, to have to do that. And back then, you pumped gas for people. It was full service. I had to wash the windshields, I had to check the oil, and I remember taking the stick to the person that was sitting in their car while I was waiting on them and show them where their oil, was at. Your oil's good, and stuff like that. And like I said, you wash the windshields, you check the oil, and you pump the gas. It was full service back then, and I didn't seem to mind that. I was just busy, and doing things. And we've had animals too, but not as much as I would have liked, but a few dogs and cats and things. And we lived out on US 2, which I don't know if that's a familiar road for people that, but from Sunning, that's US 2 is one of the busy roads and stuff. And I remember a car accident when I was about 8 years old, and that was pretty upsetting because my parents were so upset and they kept running out blankets and things like that, for the car accident. But we didn't hear, any details or anything because they wanted to protect us from that, but it was just, it was a hectic time. It was busy. We had friends in the neighborhood, and that we'd hang out with and play with. And like I said, a small school, but we became really good friends. I mean, the 8 of us were just tight and really good friends because we went through school, through kindergarten through 8th grade together, and there's 4 girls and 4 boys, in our class. And it was just I think it was a nice school to go to and things. And since we had such individualized attention, and I had high grade point, I was put into high school at the top of, the honor classes, which I was able to handle because we had that individualized attention, at Girl Cap School. And high school I went to drama, I ran track, and I worked at Clyde's restaurant. I don't know if everybody's familiar with that, but very popular restaurant even way back when, and so I was a car hop, and I ended up I graduated to actually cooking breakfast, and stuff. Went from a car hop to a cook for a while and stuff, and I was pretty proud of myself for being able to do that. And like I said, I worked at Clyde's for most of throughout high school, except for my first job, which was a mystery spot. That was my very first job I had at age 14. And I still remember, you've heard of Isaac Newton's, theory, what goes up must come down. Well, not at the mystery spot. And so we would demonstrate a ball going uphill and stuff like that. It's kind of a weird situation, but it was, a pretty neat job. But Clyde Van Dusen came to my parents and said, we want your daughter to work at Clyde's. And so that's why my short-lived time at the mystery spot, only a couple months, and I ended up working at Clyde's because I was requested. For some reason, he knew my work ethic or whatever, seeing me at my dad's and working there and stuff like that. And so I ended up at Clyde's. I was married the first time When I was 19, I dated the same guy I dated since 10th grade. And so we ended up getting married. We've had 2 children, and then that situation didn't work out, and so I ended up divorcing him and marrying my second husband back in '93, and so married him in 1994, and we've been married now for 33 years, and it's a pretty good marriage. We're more best friends, and we enjoy doing things together. One of our favorite things is being outside. I love being outside, and it's like, it kills me when there's a blizzard, because I can't get outside in a blizzard, and then if there's a lightning storm, because those are my requirements. I don't do lightning and I don't do blizzards for walking. Otherwise, I'll walk in the snow, I walk in the rain, I walk all the time, and we have a pretty lucky dog that gets walked pretty much every day except for a blizzard and lightning storms, and I thoroughly enjoy being outside. It's like if I don't get outside, I feel like I'm gonna bust, and so I have to be outside. And I know that's kind of a traditional thing too with Native Americans, that we love the outdoors, we love the commune with nature, and I'll do walking meditations when I'm outside, and I particularly like being in the woods, but we got to be careful right now because there's a lot of ticks this year. And I researched that last night. When there's a lot of ticks, it means that the ecosystem is not balanced. We either don't have enough predators or we have too many deer, but something's off balance. That's why so many ticks. Because I have to figure out things. I have to get to the bottom of things. What are the purpose of ticks, for example, because I'm wondering, because they're such a pest and I don't like them, so I researched that, and then, so what purpose do they serve? And I learned that they actually weed out the weaker animals, with their bites and things, and so they limit. They try. They're the ones that limit our, overpopulation of deer and things like that. And they serve as food for opossums and things. And so I had to learn that. I was told to bring pictures, and I don't know where to begin. I don't know if you can see this.
I'm going to scan the pictures after.
Okay.
Pictures of them and I'll put them in the edit like that.
Okay, I'll just talk about it then.
Yeah, talk about your lineage.
This is my grandfather, and this is his mother,
You don't even have to hold the picture up.
and Suzanne LeVague. I've just written a story that ended with my grandfather, and I started with, Ozawa Meek and Isaac LeVague. They're now getting elderly, and he was a French fur trader, and she was an Ojibwe maiden, and they ended up marrying, and so they are my great grandparents, and then I go into the great grandparents, which is Antoine Paucan, and so I don't know if you're familiar with the Ojibwe Museum in Sinignas. But that was the first Catholic church in Sinignas. And my Antoine Paucan, my great-great-grandfather, helped build that. And he married Suzanne LeVague, and they had all these children. And this was his second marriage. He had 7 children in the first marriage. And then she gave birth to 14, and Suzanne and Antoine. In the second marriage, 2 didn't survive, but 12 lived. But she makes me related to so many people because it's such a huge family and things. So that part, I was very interested in getting to the bottom of things and what was that like. And she was a medicine woman, Ozawa Meek, and so, I learned what that meant, and I, provided information about what it was like to become a medicine woman. My father, he served in the Korean War back in the 50s, and don't know how long he served. I think he was there for about 3 or 4 years, maybe 2 to 4 years. He was there for quite a while, but he believed in serving his country and doing what he needed to do, to make the country safe. And this is me when I graduated with my master's in social work degree. back in 2001. And that's when I was able to do an extensive, it took me 16 months. I worked on a master's thesis for 16 months. I knew that my mother went to the boarding school, in Harbor Springs, the Holy Child boarding school, but she didn't talk about it, and a lot of people didn't, okay? And so Sharon, with her big questions always in her head, I had to say, what is a boarding school? What does that mean, And so I had this huge question in my head. Well, I'm going to go and see if I can develop a committee, and I'm going to do a boarding school master's thesis, okay? And the title of that was The After Effects of the Boarding School Experience for Native Americans in Michigan. And I was all over the state. I was in Lansing. I don't know if you know where DeWitt is, but anyways, meeting someone who attended the federal boarding school, because I didn't just interview people that went to the Holy Childhood. I wanted to see what it was like for people who attended the federal boarding school. And so he went to the federal boarding school down in Mount Pleasant. Now it's harder to find people who went to that boarding school because that closed in 1933. And so the people I interviewed back in 2000 were like in their 80s, and then I interviewed another gentleman in Sault Ste. Marie and a woman who attended the federal boarding school, and 6 people who attended the Holy Child boarding school in Harbor Springs. Holy Child boarding school was the rougher, the worst, place to be, according to the people I interviewed. Most of them had the same phobia, fear of the dark. They didn't have that phobia with the ones who attended the federal boarding school. But my 16-month project, I definitely learned what a boarding school was. I had to do an extensive literature review, and so I had to learn, from whatever sources I could get, and there wasn't a lot of sources regarding the Holy Child boarding school that I did manage to find some, and I learned this is what a boarding school is. Children were taken from their homes and placed in these, often not in the same community, these buildings with people that were providing them an education, and with the Holy Childhood also about religion extensively. And some of the questions that came up is why these people that were religious, why did they end up being so mean? Religion and meanness, it didn't seem to go together. And they were trying to change who they thought of themselves, who these kids were. If you don't buy into this religion, you're going to die, a horrible death, and with pitchforks and everything else. I mean, that's part of the fear of the dark, that tell them that they're gonna, that bad things are gonna happen to them if they don't buy into this religion. And they're trying to change their identity. And so many of the people who went, especially to the Holy Child boarding school, they had identity confusion. Who are we? What are we? And I discovered that if they went to, they went for a multiple amount of years, like let's say from 6 to before they went to high school. The boarding schools didn't teach high school. They didn't go up to high school. So once they hit that age, they had to go back to their communities and attend their high school, okay, the public high school. And so they've had all those years of reprogramming, and they were different people when they came out of there. And so they didn't even match with their family a lot of times. They were strangers even to their parents and to their younger siblings who didn't end up going to the school. Not all siblings that were forced to go. Like in my mother's family, there was 8 children. The oldest 5 went to the boarding school, and the younger 3 didn't end up going. And so they get out of the school, and they end up being, they're reprogrammed. They don't even know who they are, and they don't fit in anywhere. And so this is why I want the message to come out there that we're still dealing with that. Because they didn't fit in anywhere, they had to, and everybody needs to belong, they had to fit somewhere. And so they'd end up, that's where unwanted pregnancies occurred. That's where they started hanging out with people to party with, so at least they fit somewhere, and so we're still dealing with that type of things that happen to our people, the Native American people. And so boarding schools did more damage than any other form of genocide in the United States. And for some reason, we haven't gotten an apology yet from the government regarding it. Okay, on to more positive notes. We are a resilient people, We still exist, and even though I was told to talk about my appearance when I was given that instruction, for some reason my hair just gets really light in the summertime and even gets white. That's who I am. But I am part French and I am Dutch too, but I get really dark, in the summertime. And but I have the high cheekbones and stuff like that. And people, like I was down in El Paso, Texas, doing a federal review, and I'll talk about that review job too. And he came up to me, even though I looked the way I look, he says, "You're an Anishinaabe, aren't you?" I looked at him and said, "How do you know that word?" And he told me that, and they were from the Kickapoo tribe, that they traveled with us, but they kept going. The Kickapoo and the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi and Odawa and others, traveled together, but they kept going. They kept going further south, but he knew that word, Anishinaabe, even though it's an Algonquin word. So the Kickapoo were originally Algonquin from that tribe, and so, but they just kept going until they went as far south as they could. They bordered Mexico, So it's quite interesting, to meet people, and we talked, and he gave me that history of how they traveled together and things. But we're resilient. There's still powwows going on. There's still, they're still trying to bring back the culture and do the things that, that we've done in the past. And I think he'll take a picture of this too, but I'll hold it up just so you see that. This is a picture of a canoe my uncle made. He has made 80 canoes. His name is Ron Paucan, and I spend time with him as much as I can. I was with him last Tuesday because I had to bring stuff down from a garage sale, and I'd rather give to the Hope Chest than any other place, secondhand shop, and because the Hope Chest does so much for the community and things down in St. Ignace. And so I took him out to lunch, and we spent time together, and we sat at home in his house, and we talked and things, and then Monday, a couple days ago, I went down there too and took him out again because my aunt Molly, he's going on 83, and so she worries about him. So she has people that would check in on him while she was gone, to a quilting, I guess, weekend or whatever, to make sure he's okay. So I ended up spending Monday with him too, and taking him out to lunch and stuff. And like I said, he's made 80 canoes. They're everywhere. They're hanging up in the truck stop. There's one hanging up. There's a couple in the Ojibwe Museum down at St. Ignace. He's made them all over the state. He's been down, I think down in Lansing area and other areas, demonstrating how to make canoes and things. He's given a class on how to make canoes out for the Bay Mills, tribe. He just believes in his thing. He's going to be 83 September 4th of this year, and he keeps pounding it into my head Stay active, Sharon. Be active. That's how you're going to survive. That's how you're going to make it, you know? And this is what he does. He makes canoes, he makes crafts, he goes out in the woods and finds these supplies to make his stuff. His grandson, Ronnie, named after him, you know, took him out the other day and he found some more birch bark, and I don't know what he's going to do with that. It takes a lot of birch bark to make a canoe, you know, and so they know exactly where to go. And he has a little card that gives him permission to go on, you know, I think federal property or state property. I don't know what it's for, what kind of property. So he can go and get this stuff. He has permission, you know, with this little card. But he's made this. He's made this rattle, and this is made with a turtle, you know, backing. And he's made this black ash basket. And he makes basket making look easy. You know, he sits there and does basket making while we're talking, you know? And someday, if I wanted to learn it, I'm sure he would work with me and teach me how to do it. But he makes it look easy. Does this look easy, everybody? I don't think it looks easy, but when he sits there and makes it, you know, and this is black ash. He loves the woods. He loves finding things. He loves animals. He has a dog that he thinks the world of, and my husband came down with me on Monday, and we had our dog with us, and he loved Lucy, her dog, you know, and this is a dream catcher I made, and I've learned how to make. And this is a pipe that I bought, you know, a ceremonial pipe. This is an abalone shell, which is used for smudging. Normally sage, but you can, you know, smudge with sweetgrass and other herbs. And the abalone shell represents water. It's one of our symbols for water. Then I brought 4 of the sacred herbs: tobacco, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass. And I don't know about you, but I love the smell of sweetgrass. And this is a quill basket made of porcupine quills, made by my Aunt Sally. And this is my medicine bag, one of my medicine bags. So if I go into the woods and I want to commune with nature and want to take some medicine with me when I commune, tobacco to put down to the Creator, or sage, or, you know, to ask for guidance and things. Because I think it's really important that if we're stuck, and I don't know, most of you probably been in periods of your life where you're stuck and you have to make a decision or important life decisions and you just can't. I highly recommend that you put tobacco down and just ask for guidance. You know, ask, hey, I need some help here, you know, and please help me with this tough decision. And I brought some other pictures too, but I don't know if you can see them. He might scan them, but I even have baby pictures of my mom and dad. This is my dad as a baby, and this is my mom as a baby. And she was like the second oldest in her family, and my dad was, I think he was the oldest. And he was I don't think he was the oldest. And he was the only boy in the family. They had 3 daughters, and then my dad and my mom had 5 brothers and 2 sisters. And so part of my lineage, part of my background, my mom's family from the Paquan side were very, very strict Catholics, Roman Catholic. Very strict Catholic, and my dad was from the Protestant side. So back in the days, he's part of the, I can't remember, the Protestant upheaval, you know, let's change the whole view from Catholicism to Protestant. He was part of that, you know, and then he married a Catholic. And he was kind of upset when he wanted to become a Mason, but he couldn't because his wife was a Catholic, and so I don't not understand that politic, but that's the way it was, and he was pretty upset about that. But yeah, I was, to this day, they wanted to talk about jobs for a while. From 1998 to 2011, I was a federal reviewer, which meant that, it's a nice word for auditor, but I would travel all over the United States reviewing Head Start programs. And I covered family and community partnerships and program design and management, which means that, what does director do and things, and how do they work with families. And so I did that from that point on, and then from 2005 to 2020, I was a college professor for Bay Mills Community College, and I taught, psychology, and I thoroughly enjoyed that too. It's part of learning, by teaching, how things tick and how things work, and with our minds and our behaviors and things like that, and because I really like to get to the bottom of things. That's why I've written so many things that I've written. Like I said, the boarding school, master's thesis. Big question was boarding school. What is my lineage? Where did I come from? So my family did some extensive research and learned about ayaa-agg and ayaa-agg, and where did they come from? And he's directly from France, and ended up coming here and being a fur trader, and he ran the fur trading, trading posts and things like that, in the Sunningness area. And so my last book had a lot to do with Sunningness in the 1800s. And believe it or not, Sunningness was a booming community. It was a hub for lumber, for fishing. They did a lot of fishing, and they shipped a lot out. And Sunningness was a port, and back then they could go through the St. Lawrence, Seaway and things to get things even, to Europe and, through that travel and stuff like that. And so it's a big port. They shipped a lot to Detroit and things too. And Sunningness is connected. The Great Lakes are connected to everything, and they're able to ship a lot out, out of Sunningness, and a lot of lumber. But with all that lumber being shipped, it's surprising that there's so many trees still in Sunningness. I'm surprised at that, with so much lumber way back when. And so my review work, I taught, what else did I do? I worked for the tribe for a while. I was like one of the early employees. I think it was like the 220th employee or something, because they used to give us the numbers of when they ordered that we were hired, and so I began working for the tribe back in 1987, and I worked for it was called at this time, and now the name has changed, but it was Johnson O'Malley program, and so that provided educational and recreational and cultural services for children of all ages. So I'd take children to powwows, I'd teach them how to make, I'd teach them how to sand paint, I'd teach them how to make chokers, we'd work on regalia for powwows, and how to sew regalia and things and make regalia. I teach them part of the language, and some basic terms, for mother and father, and the words for that and things, and I began, I don't know how long ago, but my mother, through my Aunt Betty, found out about Jake Pine. And Jake Pine lives in Garden River over in Canada. And so for the longest time, now that situation is separated and Jake Pine lives someplace else, but for the longest time, God, how long ago now? Probably late 90s, maybe, early 2000s. We would go over to Garden River and go to the sweat lodge there. And Jake Pine was a medicine man and a spiritual healer. So if you had any questions and things, if you're exploring things like what's going on, and you could ask him. He would do some healing, he'd do some healing ceremonies. He provided a lot for our family. He gave me my native name, which is Ayaa-agg, which is Eagle Woman. And he gave my family, my siblings, my mother, their names, and so we spent some time in that. And so to this day, and I think I want to do more sweat lodges, and I need to make more time for that. But it was I felt so refreshed and so, I don't know, lack of a better word, cleansed when I would do a sweat lodge ceremony, and I felt balanced, and it's such a serious ceremony, when you go into you have to go in a certain order, and you're saying, we were told that we needed to say miigwech, which is say the word thank you, to the Creator for the things we have, the things that we're blessed with, the food we have to eat, the air we have to breathe, the water we have to drink, because these are not things we should take for granted. They could be easily taken from us. Look what happened in Sault Ste. Marie when they decided it was a good idea to put the waste in from that factory in our water. This was a long time ago, when that waste was being put in the water, but there's still some effects from that. They're still picking up a little minute, specks of pollution from when they did that. It takes a while to recover from when things are done like that. So we need to be thankful for the water we have to drink and the air we have to breathe. And, and right now we're a little bit, there's some pollution in the air right now because of the fires in Canada, and so we have to be aware of that, in case you have asthma or anything, you need to be aware of that. But hopefully that goes away soon, and there was actually somebody took a picture of it, but I guess the smoke is like attracted to water, like it gravitates over water, but it looked like there was a massive fog over the Mackinac Bridge when it was actually the smoke from Canada, and so what is that doing to our, our air right now and things, and at one really bad day, my dog spent a little bit of time outside, probably a little too much time, and she got sick. So I think the air made her, she doesn't get sick, and so I was worried about Lucy and stuff, but the air's not probably good for even my dog, for a while, and so she was kept inside with the windows closed, for a while and stuff, and only put outside when needed to be, and so we can't take these things for granted. We have to appreciate what we have in our life. We have to appreciate the food we have on our plate, the water we have to drink, and even the people in our lives, and nature, and like I had to get to the bottom of ticks. What's the importance of ticks and why do they exist? Because I don't know about you, but I don't like ticks. They're actual parasites, and but they do serve a purpose, and so there's a reason why the Creator made them, and we just have to kind of watch out for them. Fortunately, our dog takes this pill or whatever that if a tick bites her, it just dies, which is a good thing, She's got some medication to protect her from tick bites and from, and flea bites and things, and so they make some amazing things out to protect animals, protect humans and things. Hopefully someday we come up with a cure for cancer. That would be nice. I feel a little bit threatened right now that they're trying to cut funding for scientific research, but hopefully that doesn't happen. So they keep researching things like cancer and how to prevent that or how to get rid of it easier, because I don't think radiation and chemo is it's not a real gentle thing for people to go through. It can make them really sick. What else should I tell you about myself? I don't know how much time I've taken. My grandfather died in 1969, the one that's Native American. So I was only, 12, So I didn't really know as much. What I do know is that he couldn't say he was Native American in order to get a job in Saint-Ignace. And so he was a constable, but he had to say he was French. He couldn't claim his Native American heritage in order to get a job. So I don't think, and like I said, he had the Jesuits live at his house, when he was a child. And so I explored, what did that mean, and they basically, the Jesuits lived in a belief of poverty. They didn't have anything, and so they would live at people's homes, part of it to convert them, and make sure they're buying into Christianity. But the other part is too, they didn't have any housing or anything, They had to live somewhere, and so I created a story where because I don't know what happened, so I had to fill in the blanks, where he learned from the Jesuits, what it was like. And then my grandfather had questions about, who is Jesus? What is the Creator? What is God? By learning two different things from his mother versus, his, because Rose was 100% Native American too. Rose St. Ange, who was my grandfather's mother, and she was Native American, and she practiced a lot of the traditions, the fasting and going into the woods and things like that. So he would see his mother doing things like that. Then he'd see his father going to the church. Okay, Alexander Pauchan was his family. The Pauchans were, like I told you in the past, earlier, they were Roman Catholics, strict Roman Catholics. That's why there were 8 children, in his family. That's why Suzanne LeVake had 14 children, very strict Catholics, and my grandfather really couldn't have any more children than 8 because he met I don't know her age, she was like 20, and he was 55 when he started having kids. Can you imagine? 55. So his first child was born when he was 55. He was 57 when my mother was born, and so, and he had to work to provide for the family, and so he was a constable, and he had a nickname. He was called Chewing Gum Alex, I guess he always chewed gum all the time, and my ex-husband's father knew him, reported of him, of how nice he was and good constable and stuff like that, where I wouldn't know that. Like I said, I was 12 when he died. So my grandfather didn't practice any traditional because he couldn't. He had to work. He had to say he was French, and because the French can have darker skin and stuff, so he had to work. It's my mother and my Aunt Betty that decided that let's try out this sweat lodge ceremonies, and so that's when we started going over there and doing that. But she didn't really practice when we were growing up. I didn't really know that I was Native American growing up, okay? That wasn't practice. It was not a good thing to be Native American in Saint-Ignace back in the 50s, back in the 60s, okay? Not a good thing. A lot of animosity towards the Native Americans back then, and they weren't trusted, they weren't, and a whole different, and so I didn't know I was Native American until I was about 17, and that's when they started Our tribe was starting to get, more established, and I was getting an Indian card at 17. I'm Indian? Okay. What does that mean, and stuff, but not a whole lot was done at that time, just an Indian card. And so, and I still have that Indian card, I still have an Indian card. But now, even my husband, he's Brunner, he's of Austrian descent and German descent, and some English. He prefers the Native American belief system as opposed to the actual religious, and we have a lot of questions about the Bible and everything else, we just kind of shake our heads. How can Noah's Ark work? What happened with that? I mean, the bigger animals didn't eat the smaller animals. What'd they do with the waste, That's just, we question all that kind of stuff, That doesn't work. And you can't flood the entire earth, And there could have been a flood. There have been floods, but probably a section of what they thought their world was, Like, let's say Babylonia or something like that. That area flooded, so they thought the world flooded, And, so we just kind of question things like that. And I do like some of the Jesus teachings. My favorite is the woman who is going to be stoned, and Jesus said, anybody who has never committed a sin can throw the first stone. She didn't get stoned because everybody committed sins. So they couldn't admit they didn't, commit a sin. So I do like some of the teachings of Jesus. I don't think it should be just completely, this is all garbage type of thing, because I believe that we can learn from all this stuff. We can learn from Islamic people and what they do. We can learn from, other things that have happened in this world. There's lessons everywhere. We would have had a better United States and a better country if the Europeans came over and said, what can we learn from these people that are, surviving in this country already? What can we learn from them? Instead of treating them as enemies, and taking their land and things, what can we learn from these people? And they did help them. They did help the Pilgrims survive the first winters and things. And they did help them with hunting and putting food on their table and how to, how to take care of themselves and survive that, the harsh winters and things. And there's so much we can learn from each other, And it's, that's what I'm always learning. I'm never, like I always say, I'm a work in progress. I always have room to grow, and I can always learn new things that'll improve me in some way, and I'm always looking for things that, finding some answers, like I said, the big boarding school question and stuff like that. And I got my questions answered, and these people told me, they gave me excellent interviews. The one woman, she went to the Holy Child boarding school, and I don't know if I can, let's pretend this is a pencil. She'd say that one of her peers in the background, while she's at the chalkboard and she couldn't figure out a math problem, would be quietly, tapping a pencil eraser on the desk, because they weren't allowed to talk much, okay? And letting her know that we're there for you. Just the quiet support. She said that they could speak volumes with their eyes. Let's say that Mary, they're already underfed, okay? And they had to clean, they had to work and run that school too. They had to do a lot of cleaning and, and dishes and everything else. They put them to work a lot, and here they don't get that much food, and so they're already underfed, the poor kids. And so let's say Mary was sent to bed without dinner, which they can't afford to not eat a meal, And so they would speak with their eyes, just look over to so-and-so, like little Susie or something like that. Make sure she gets food, with just their eyes, communicating with their eyes. Make sure she gets food, And then the person that I'm interviewing right now and working with to tell his life story, I brought this up to him. What Yolanda said during the interview, and Yolanda's not a real name. I changed their names, when I did the master's thesis project. But Yolanda said that she can be on the street in Petoskey or something, walking down the street, and she'll look at somebody, and just the way they look at each other, they know that they went to the same place, just by the look in their eyes. And so I said that to John, the person I'm interviewing, for the next book I'm working on, and he said, that's right. I have done that. I have met people who went to the Holy Childhood, and we didn't even have to talk. We just knew. And it kind of brought tears to Lana and I's eyes. Lana's his daughter, and it's like, but he discovered that I can speak its language. I know what he went through at the boarding school. He wants to talk to me all the time. I can speak his language, He knows I know what he went through with my interviews, with my history, what I've studied, and he's not alone now. He knows someone knows about what he's been through and stuff, and he wants to, he wants to talk with me, and I talked to him on the phone a couple days ago, and I want to know more about, he actually lives on the same property that he was born and raised. And they call it Osagwan. And she told me what that meant, but I don't remember right now. But that has a native meaning for that. And it's their family name and things. And so what does that property mean? John Stott has written some books on having a small cabin in the woods, in the UP of Michigan. And he says, place is everything. Location is everything. And so that's really set with me. And then the history of the Native Americans losing their homelands, and this is where they were born and raised. This is what they knew, And so this is what he knows. This land, this is where he lives. I mean, it's a beautiful area because his daughter sent me a picture of this is what I looked at, when I was drinking my coffee this morning with my father on his porch, and it's a view of the water, and stuff, and so it's property that, he's owned forever, and he's given the opportunity by his father his father said, you can have this, just give me $10,000 and it's all yours, And there's, I don't know how much acreage, but it's a decent amount, of acreage and stuff too. And he's on the water, which is probably prime in Hessel, right? Waterfront property in Hessel. And so, and that's where he lives, and they lived forever. And so, and what I've gotten so far from him, he's a pipe carrier, is that he's actually had some funeral rites. He's done some as a pipe carrier, some funeral ceremonies, on that property. And so, but there's probably other things that will come out later on. But I want to know how important that property is. What have they done? What have they, because this is where he's lived all his life, What does that mean? And like he said, he's a pipe carrier, and like he's had some ceremonies on the property, which makes it sacred, and what else makes it sacred? And, that some tribes have actually buried umbilical cords on the property, and things like that. And so then when they had to be forced to leave that, they're leaving their babies, they're leaving things that are so important to them. And they're forced to move west and things. And I don't think St. Ignace was disrupted as much as other areas, back in the 1800s and things. Even back like the 1930s and the late 1800s, they thought the UP was a wasteland, which provided to our benefit, There's nothing there, there's no interest, anything else. Until copper got discovered, and other things, but it was a wasteland. I mean, Marquette, I just completed a story regarding Marquette and its history. And part of what Marquette, why they had a great big area that had iron ore. So people were interested in that. And it was mined so much that it almost doesn't exist anymore, the iron ore. And it was behind this sacred tree, or behind this tree, and where this mine was, and and so it had a lot of meaning and stuff. And according to my research and what I've learned from doing this book, there were superstitions regarding minerals with Native Americans. They didn't understand the importance of the mineral to the white people. Why is this so important to them? And they were superstitious about that. If it's important to them, it might not be good, right? There might be some bad things tied to it and stuff. And so Marquette was basically established because of the iron ore. And 2 or 3 iron ore companies, mining companies, are what built the city, and then at one point there were only 8 Native Americans living there when these mining companies were there. Gibbaakan, do you know him? Gibbaakan? He's famous in the area. He's famous in Marquette. And I just did that review on Gibbaakan, written by Tyler Tichler. And he's a Native American man who welcomed Peter White. Are you familiar with Peter White? They even named a library after him. He ended up being one of the richest, most prominent men in Marquette at that time. And when Gibbaakan died, he was so upset, because they became friends. Peter White and Gibbaakan were friends, and he welcomed Peter White to the area. He showed him the ropes, and stuff. And Gibbaakan and Peter White were, like I said, friends throughout until Gibbaakan died. He lived past when Gibbaakan died. And so I mean, the history of things and minerals, and when the UP became a little bit more prominent because of the minerals, with the copper and and that iron ore and stuff. And according to the author, the iron ore that was discovered in Marquette in the late 1800s, like 1880s, 1890s, something like that, led to the industrialization of the United States, which I found quite interesting. They needed that iron ore to make the factories and and everything else, and so it led to the industrialization of the United States. It's Marquette, and according to Tyler Tichler, it's quite interesting, isn't it? And so a small group of Native Americans lived at the time. There were 4 adults and 4 children that were there when the mining companies descended, and this was discovered, and the iron ore was discovered and things. And one of and I can't remember his name now, his long, weird name, but anyways, he showed the mining company where the ore was and stuff. And but yeah, and so this part of, so Marquette has a big, big part of how the United States was developed, even, with the iron ore and stuff. I do a lot of book reviews, and that was a very interesting one, learning about the discovery of Marquette and how Marquette was established through the mining companies and things. And I just completed a book review for, I don't know if you know Michael Carrier. He writes a lot of murder mysteries, basically. And some are centralized in the UP of Michigan. He's from Grand Rapids, but he has a cabin in Paradise, Michigan. And so Evie and him decided to do this book together, and it's about their lives. And it's like 500 pages long, and it only covers 1968 to 72, you know? And it's called Tracks, Trax. And then the second part of the title is Made in New York, 1968 through 72, -72. And so they did a memoir. And it was quite interesting because he would say, and I learned a lot of history about New York City through this book, you know? What were the buildings back in the 1960s and things, you know, right? And some of the businesses and things that were going on in that time period. So he would tell his side of the story for an event, and she would tell her side of the story. And then they have a skinny at the end of the chapter about, well, this is what really happened type of thing, you know? And but sometimes their stories were similar and sometimes they were different, you know? And so it tells me that who really knows the truth of what happened throughout our lives, you know, because it depends on who's telling the story, right? You know, who's telling, you know, where did their information come from? You know, and we had a discussion the other day and with this group of people and talked about where children weren't permitted to talk much, you know, way back when and stuff like that. And I just piped up and said, my dad actually said children should be seen and not heard. But that was the time period. That's what was happening at that time period. And so this is what he knew, you know, and what he heard and what was going on at that time period. And but the boarding schools, they were actually not permitted to communicate, you know, and they couldn't talk at meals and things like that. And a study was done, and I can't think of the study's name right now, but the study was done there, you know, back in, you know, at the Holy Child boarding school. And one of the comments they made was it was so quiet for children. It was so quiet. So to be trained not to voice your opinion, not to have an opinion, not to have a say, not to, you know, not to be able to communicate with your peers, you know, and what did that do? You know, keep quiet, keep secrets, you know, and things like that. So yeah, a lot of interesting things. But like I said, I thoroughly enjoyed even reading the book about Kabakan, you know, and Marquette's history, you know, learning about Marquette, you know, and Sault Ste. Marie has a strong history, you know, and this is part of my studies. This is part of one of my books, you know, and Shadow Travelers, and I covered John Johnston. He was the fur trader, you know, in Sault Ste. Marie, you know, way back when. But he had a really good relationship with the tribal people, which is not always the case, you know. And he was a fur trader. And his home is on, you know, I think it's Water Street, on, you know, downtown in Sault Ste. Marie. His actual home, John Johnston's home, you know, and Henry Schoolcraft's home is there, and you know, and so you could see these places and how they lived, and you know, and what they did, and you know, and but fur trading was a huge thing in this community, in Sault Ste. Marie, you know, and I have to say something, and I put this in the back of my mind, and I forgot, you know, in the museum and in the Valley Camp, where they talked about fur trading, they only mentioned the hard work of the voyagers, not the Native Americans. Without the Native Americans, the furs wouldn't exist. And the Europeans wanted the thickest beaver fur. So when did they have to go into that freezing cold water to get those beaver? In the wintertime, in the colder months, to get the thickest fur. And they're the ones who got the beaver, you know, captured the beaver, cleaned the pelts, you know, and that's, to me, it's very hard work, you know. and very not, who would want to go in that cold water and get those beaver, right? And not very comfortable work. And they're not even mentioned. They mention the voyagers and the canoeing, for multiple hours. Wouldn't you rather be in a canoe than the freezing water? Right? So I do have to mention it to these two museums about who got the furs for them, The Native Americans need to be mentioned, and so I can't make that a forefront. I need to bring that into the, because they do need to be mentioned, that what they did to the fur trading. The fur trading wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Native Americans. They're the ones who captured the beaver. They're the ones who cleaned the beaver, and prepared the skins. And it went against their nature, because they may have killed like 35 beavers a year. They only killed what they needed. Millions of beavers were killed for the fur trading business. It went against their nature. It's like a wasteful thing to kill so many beaver. But then they started liking the iron pots and the guns and, needing these things. They needed to upgrade it, so they'd go in that freezing water, but don't they need to be mentioned? Don't the Native Americans need to be mentioned on those walls, the museum walls? I think so. I think there's a resurgence. I think that now we feel we can do powwows and things. You have to remember that from like 1880 or something to 1978, it was outlawed, these spiritual practices. And so now I feel there's a resurgence and people are interested. People are going to powwows. And even people of all races are going to powwows, and they're enjoying watching the dancing and finding out about things. Why does the jingle dancer dance? What's that all about? She's trying to help you heal. She's a healing dancer. I was a female traditional dancer, and so why did I do that? I was honoring Mother Earth, and these dances have meanings, and their regalia, I just can't even, is beautiful. A lot of the regalia is just absolutely gorgeous. And I'm friends with the daughter that runs the Ojibwe Museum. Her name was Olivia. It takes her a year to make her regalia. And she has these beaded leggings and everything else. They put so much time and effort into these, And it's like a sense of pride, that they're so happy with who they are and what that means, And so I think there's a resurgence of the culture, of the what it meant in the past, and they're discovering that we kind of knew what we needed to do, we needed to commune with nature, we needed to, and now they're learning that meditation and things, is really good for you. Well, what was a vision fast, That's like days of meditation, and they went into the woods and they communed with nature, and it was just, they came out, new people, Well, that's getting noticed now that maybe we knew what we were talking about. We knew how to live a balanced life. I was toying with, because I gave a presentation, addressing the needs of, Native Americans in literature, for the Upper Peninsula's Publishers and Authors Association. And I'm thinking about maybe I could give one on balance. Don't just make your life writing, sitting at that computer, You need to get out and walk and see nature and, make it a balance, get some exercise, eat right, make sure you eat right, drink plenty of water, take care of yourself, and we can't really take care of anybody else until we take care of ourselves, and so take care of ourselves and by pampering ourselves and taking a bath in Epsom salts and things like that. But I think there's a resurgence I think that there's a lot of pride right now with Native Americans, and people are interested. Next question. To me, the one that sticks out is how the skunk got a smell. You know, and do you want me to tell that, or? Oh, okay. So, a long time ago, animals and people got along. You know, they were best friends, and they hung out together, and they did things together, you know, and things like that. Then one day, man started hunting animal. Well, animals needed protection. You know, and bears had their claws, long claws and things, and they're big and teeth and things. And, you know, well, skunk didn't have any way to protect himself. He's a small little animal, you know, cute with a, you know, white stripe going down his back. You know, he had no way of protecting himself. So he went to Nanabush. And Nanabush is like, I guess the best way to define him, he's like Jesus, you know, he's the Creator's right-hand man, okay? He can provide things, you know, supernatural things, help animals, help people. You know, he's very strong, powerful, you know, being. And so skunk went to Nanabush. Nanabush, I need help. I don't have any way of protecting myself. And so Nanabush says, well, okay, I'll tell you what. I'll give you these long, sharp, long teeth. And so skunk goes, okay, that might work. So skunk walks away, and he's, you know, sporting his new long teeth and everything, and he ends up catching his vision, his appearance in the water, you know, his reflection in the water. He goes, oh, I don't think I look good with these long teeth. Okay, I'm gonna have to go back to Nanabush and get something different, you know. And so he goes back to Nanabush, and Nanabush's teeth aren't working. I need something else. And so Nanabush says, okay, I'll give you these long, powerful claws, and you know, your back and front feet, you know, he paws. And so he goes, okay, I'll try that out. So he's like clicking away, you know, on the ground and stuff like that, and trying to, you know, run and trying to walk and stuff. And he didn't like how his claws sounded. They made a clicking sound, and he didn't like how it felt when he tried to walk with them. And so he goes back to Nanabush. You know, he says, these claws aren't working. You know, I need something different. Okay, how about I give you the ability to run really fast? He goes, well, that might work. That doesn't change my appearance, you know? So he says, I'll try that. And so, and you gotta understand skunk, he was a little bit vain. He was a good-looking animal with that white stripe and everything, you know? And so, so he tried the running thing, and he decided, you know, they're not going to be able to see my beautiful white stripe if I run really fast. Running really fast is not going to work for me. So he goes back to Nanabush. Nanabush is getting a little bit tired of this situation, right? You know, skunk is being hard to please. And so he gives skunk this bag. He says, skunk, if you ever feel threatened, squeeze the bag. Well, that doesn't change my appearance. I'm not going to be clacking on the ground. They can see my beautiful white stripe because I'm not going to be too fast. This might work, you know, and so he takes the bag. Well, dog comes up to him and says, you know, skunk, do you want to come over for dinner tonight, blah, blah, you know, and then, you know, and spend time together. And then skunk decides, I'm going to try this bag out. So he squeezes it. Well, dog just steps back and says, oh my goodness, you know, he didn't like the smell at all and stuff. So he runs off and he tells the other animals, don't go near skunk. You know, it's awful, you know. And so skunk ends up spending a lot of time alone. And so what's the moral of the story? What? Well, don't be too picky, you know, for one thing, right? You know, and he needed to be satisfied with what he had, right? Because he lost a lot of friendships, you know, because he had that bad smell. Okay, that's the end of the legend. Now he had me tell the legend after he asked me about a legend, okay, or what I learned, okay? Use it as much as possible. Use the language. Say miigwech as much as possible. Say the word for like mother, for example, nimamad. Say ozan for father. You know, integrate it wherever you can. You know, put it in your newsletters. Put it in the newspaper. You know, integrate it wherever you can. Give signs, you know, and they do that. They do a good job of that, giving the signs and stuff like that. They really do a good job of that. But just pointing it out. Use it as much as you can. Try to put it into even every day. You know, I put it in my book as much as I can. And towards the end, all I did was use the word uzan or nimama for mother and father, you know, and stuff. And then people would grasp that, you know, and I gave them the Anishinaabe to English and English Anishinaabe, you know, in the back of the appendix. So they have the words, you know, and even basic things, put it in as much as you can. Promote powwows and things, you know, and have more celebrations. You know, do more of the practices. You know, have more sweat lodge ceremonies, have more, you know. We had a treaty summit back in the 90s here. That was an excellent, you know, and I met Edward Benton Benet, you know, the one who wrote the Moshoma's book, you know, the Word of the Ojibwe and stuff like that. And he told the creation story in both Ojibwe, you know, the Anishinaabe and then English. But we need more things like that, you know. And when I was in the sweat lodge and the native songs were being sung in the language, it's weird, but I felt like I understood a lot of what was being, you know, said when I was in the sweat lodge. You know, I can't understand that, but I did, you know, and but use it as much as possible. Put it in things, you know, promote things, have more ceremonies, you know, and just make it a big part of everybody's life, you know, that they know about these things. It gives me a sense of my background. You know, what did it mean to go on a vision quest? What did it mean to be a medicine woman? What does it mean to do any of those other things? And I'm a Reiki master, a Reiki massage master. I'm not a medicine woman, but I have actually made people feel better, even walk better. You know, I don't know if you know Warren Bataski. He lives actually more closer to Charlevoix than Bataski, but he was in pain one day and I gave him a Reiki massage and he was not in pain, you know, for a while. It's not forever, you know, but it's like, so I mean, it feels good to help people, you know, but do I have that ability because my ancestors were medicine women, you know, or I don't know, you know, but Ayaa-agg was a medicine woman. Her offspring were medicine women, and you know, what does that mean, you know, and just knowing and seeing an owl or seeing a wolf or seeing, you know, all these birds that have meaning and things, you know, and knowing you know, what I stand for, but being an eagle woman, Megashikwe, I'm supposed to be a teacher. You know, I'm supposed to teach and spread the word and things like that. And so I enjoy like getting these books out, and I love that they sell so much at the Ojibwe Museum. I'm getting the word out, you know. I'm getting the word out about, you know, the treaty, about, you know, our ceremonies, everything else, you know, and the history and stuff. And I really like this last book about the word about, you know, the Saningness and how important that community was. But I feel a connection to, I think, the earth and nature because of my background, because of my Native American background. I get it. I get how important it is and how much we have to protect it. I do recycle, I do compost, and things to do whatever I can to save the earth, and whatever I can to, because it's so important. And Native Americans teach us that, Mother Earth, you need to take care of her. And I'm not liking how much plastic exists in this world, and what it's doing to the oceans. And I know that's part of my Native American heritage because I care, I really care about it, and what's happening that, like turtles are choking on plastic and, and everything else in the oceans. And, how sad. Let's save them. Let's get rid of all this waste and, and plastic and stuff. Go to hemp. You don't need plastic. You can use hemp, and things. And so I think it's given me a tie to nature, a tie to the importance of Mother Earth, a sense of meaning, why I am who I am and what I do, and spreading the word and getting the word out and stuff. And I like it. I like who I am, and I like that history. Gosh.
If it's not, it's fine. I got one.
Being in the sweat lodge and actually seeing one of my spirit guides, Grey Wolf, and I can tell you what exactly he looks like, and how I was debating, because we had 3 dogs at the time, and this younger dog was knocking down the older dog, and I asked Grey Wolf, should we keep this dog? Because I'm feeling bad for the older dog, and stuff. And Grey Wolf told me, yes, keep him. He ended up being one of the best dogs and one of my best friends, and stuff. And I'm really glad I kept Doogie. I thought he told me to call him Doogie, but I'm sure that's not what he said. But probably keep the dog or whatever. But but he ended up being Doogie because that's what I thought Grey Wolf told me. But Grey Wolf has been there for me, when I have questions and stuff like that. And I actually can describe to you what he looks like. When I'm in a sweat lodge, he's like right in front of me, And I don't know if that's not exactly a story, but that's kind of where I come from and stuff. And like I said, he even told me, I know Grey Wolf likes dogs. So if I told him that, and should I keep these 10 dogs, he'd probably say yes. so that's the way he is, he's Grey Wolf, but yeah, Grey Wolf has been a really big part of my life. And it's helped me through things, and it's guided me. And I'm really glad I listened to him when we kept Doogie, because Doogie even danced with me. We'd go back and forth and dance together and stuff like that. And ended up, during the pandemic, and stuff, all the walking I did with him and stuff, because you couldn't go anywhere or do anything, We ended up being best friends, and Grey Wolf was right. Keep Doogie, And it's like, so we had 3 dogs, 3 big dogs, but Grey Wolf has been part of my life for quite a while. And he's, like I said, he's shown himself to me. And that says a lot to me, Like other people think, oh, you're crazy. You see people, stuff like that. No, it's not. He's real. I've seen him. He's real. So, and he's been there a lot for me. He's helped me. Go ahead. It's my phone. I want to be remembered by spreading the word, by my books, by doing good for other people, and by, like my uncle says, his religion is being a good person. I want to be a good person. I want to be remembered by, I was a good person. I just, cared about people, and I was there for people, and, and my spirituality is important to me, and I got the word out in a way that didn't offend people, that just, they were able to, I even did a self-help book in addressing historical trauma, and where even Caucasian people can read it and it can help them, a book review was done by Tyler with that book, and he says, yeah, this is so useful. I gave really, part of what I told people to do was find out where you came from, because that gives you a sense of belonging, and build on that, who you are, and where you came from, and stuff. And obviously I covered trauma recovery and things, and naming your trauma and dealing with that and stuff. But I gave helpful other hints of volunteer, be out in the community, be with people, so that you're not alone, you're not, and you're helping other people. And my sister was struggling with her sister-in-law, and sister-in-law was taking over, everything, from a parent's funeral and stuff, a parent's death. And I said, instead of getting upset with her, ask her what she needs. My sister said, oh my God, I get that. Yes, I'll do that. Instead of being so upset with her that she's like taking over everything and, and doing all this, ask her what she needs. She's obviously hurting too, She lost a parent, and stuff. So I like to go that route. Ask them what they need. What do you, who are you? What's important to you? So I want to be remembered as being a good person, getting the word out, hopefully people, will follow my lead too and stuff. And because Eagle people are supposed to teach and lead, and so hopefully I'm teaching the right things and doing the right things and being there for people. And I want people to get, how important it is to be who they are and what they need to do. And